reasons why measuring and promoting diversity is a good idea, and there are many ways in which this can be done. So we'll be talking about those reasons and methods in this session, as well as some of the important things to consider in the process. For example, ethics, how the process can be inclusive, how and when to involve minority groups, and what to do with the data once you have it. So I'd like to introduce my very full and very brilliant panel. First, we have Zamila Bunglawala, Deputy Director of the Race Disparity Audit at the Cabinet Office, which has delivered the Ethnicity Facts and Figures website. Zamila is also a visiting fellow at the International Inequalities Institute at the London School of Economics. We also have Amy Turton, who's the Project Diamond Manager at the Creative Diversity Network, which is the TV industry's diversity monitoring project on behalf of the 5 main UK broadcasters. We have Christine Forde, an HR and organizational development consultant, currently working as a workforce, equalities, diversity and inclusion manager at the Greater London Authority. We have Georgia Thompson, a civil engineer and STEM careers coach, and founder of Virginia's Thoughts, which is a social enterprise offering careers development, advice and coaching for young people. And finally, our token man. I did clear that with Mark and asked if it was insulting, and he said it was fine. So, Managing Director of Equal Engineers, which connects inclusive employers and diverse talent in engineering and technology, specifically targeting underrepresented groups. Mark is also the chair and co-founder of Inter Engineering, which is a professional network of over 1,000 LGBT plus engineers. And as a reminder, we'll use Slido in this session. So if you haven't logged in already, you can get your phone out or your laptop and go to slido.com. The event code is ODI, hashtag ODI Summit 2018. I think it's up there as well. And you can choose Hall 1 and just ask questions as you like. I do have my lovely assistant, Dave, somewhere in the audience. Dave, where are you at? Hi there. Who will be monitoring, so just behave. Right, so without any further ado, I'd like to start with some of the reasons why measuring diversity is a good idea in general. Many agree that it's a good thing, but I think often businesses and governments and groups often don't understand quite the link between measuring and promoting and then sort of benefits, business benefits and so on. Zamila, the racial disparity audit is an unprecedented initiative to understand racial inequalities across the UK. Clearly, it's been a huge undertaking for the government. So how is it decided upon, and what are the core issues that it set out to solve?
So the Prime Minister commissioned the project in 2016 from my team, and the objective was to publish ethnicity data onto a website. So we actually in the UK have the best equality data in the world, that is true. But where is it published, how accessible is it, and can non-expert users actually understand it? That was a key question. So the Prime Minister asked us to build a website that would put all this data in a form that anybody could use, from expert user to member of the public. And also just to make sure that we identify the uncomfortable truths, because we do know in our society that ethnic minority groups do fare worse in certain industries, in certain sectors, in education and employment. What we didn't know is how widespread those disparities are. So doing a stock take of all government data and then putting it on a website is just massive. No government in the world has ever done it before. So it was great for my team in that there's no blueprint, so you start from scratch. But also because we were looking at unpublished data for the first time, we were looking at data that most people were not aware of for the first time, and then trying hard in partnering with ODI actually to make it accessible so that in addition to your academics and your NGO expert user, the public can actually utilize this data, can access it, they can go take it off the board. But then it's great to have the data, but you have to do something with it. So that's the other sort of goal of data, which is to actually take action. And since we built the website, it went live last year in October, we've announced various policies on school exclusion issues, mental health issues, improving employment for ethnic minority groups. And the one I'm most proud of just came out a month ago, which is a consultation on ethnicity pay reporting, building on gender pay reporting. And I think this is the way forward for data, especially on inequalities, to actually make it accessible, to make it transparent, and to allow any user to actually download it, take it away, and do something with it.
Brilliant, thank you. So Amy, there are some similarities here really with Project Diamond, it being the first diversity initiative of its size across one whole industry. So how are the 5 main broadcasters engaged to commit to this initiative in the first place?
Well, 3 of them kind of set up and design the whole project at the start. Similarly, there was data being collected in the industry, but it wasn't all being put in one place. It was being collected in different, inconsistent ways. So the idea was to put together one single database of who is working in television across the UK. So three of them, as I said, started it off, and then the other two joined shortly afterwards once they realised the merits in doing it together as an industry.
What do they see as in it for them?
I think it varies. I think with TV content is obviously about good ideas, creativity, and that requires new ideas and new people entering the workforce. And so one of the things they wanted to do was to understand where they're kind of missing an opportunity and being underrepresented in certain protected characteristics. The other thing I think is their audiences as well, the kind of expectation that people see themselves represented on screen. One of the questions that we try and answer through the data that we collect is, are people seeing themselves on screen? So that was really important for them as well.
Do you think it's made much impact so far?
I think it has. The whole project has really brought the industry together a lot more to talk about diversity, and the production sector as well. The production sector is a lot of independent production companies, but collectively they're the kind of collective suppliers for broadcasters. So it's changing the conversations that broadcasters can have with the production companies, and also it kind of sets up a new transparent way that we're monitoring diversity. So data can't be kind of released and then hidden a few years later. People kind of forget about it, and different surveys, different reports. It's putting it all in one place, reporting on it consistently again and again and again. So any initiatives that are put in place, because there have been plenty in the industry before, you can kind of monitor the actual impact that they're having, which ones are having an impact and which ones aren't, and if not, why not?
We work a lot on data standards or around data standards at the ODI, so it seems like there are kind of similarities there in the sense of it being a way in which groups can publish to a similar sort of, well, standard, I suppose. Do you think there are lessons for other industries looking to undertake a similar sort of diversity initiative across organisations?
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't been necessarily an easy thing to do, especially when, you know, all the broadcasters involved, they are competitors in many ways, but it is one area that they were keen to work together, recognising that it would be, you know, beneficial for all of them, all of the UK broadcasters. Yeah, I suppose finding a kind of common way. The broadcasters were lucky in a sense that they already had a common software platform that they were collecting information about the programmes that they make from their production companies, which production companies were used to using, and it was already inputting names of cast and crew, so it was just a case of kind of expanding on that system that they already had. So I think that really helped.
Great, thank you. So STEM, as in science, technology, engineering and maths, is generally considered to have some way to go in equality of opportunity across diverse groups. Mark, you co-founded Equal Engineers to promote diversity and inclusion within the engineering and construction industries. On your website, it says diversity and inclusion helps to increase performance growth and innovation. Can you elaborate a little bit on sort of how, say for business leaders that can't quite see the link yet?
Well, there's only 11% of the workforce that are female in engineering, so 8 to 9% are male. Unfortunately for that group that need to be convinced, they sometimes need to have a personal activation point to start emboldening and fully supporting diversity and inclusion initiatives. And it's usually because they've got a daughter or that someone who's experienced some inequity or some inequality, they all of a sudden become supporters. And it's a shame that you have to trundle out the McKinsey report analysis, etc., that shows on aggregate more gender diverse boards, etc., have greater returns. So I think there's an element of, what we've done to be more effective is flip the gender conversation on its head and focus on masculinity in engineering. I spoke on a panel at the Women in Construction Engineering Awards, spoke about mental health and well-being and the negative effects on men and what it means to be a man in engineering. And all of a sudden, all the women in the room started talking about the experiences of their husbands, the sort of pressures that they face through having to work longer hours, attributed due to the gender pay gap, etc., because family structures haven't allowed, you know, equality in leave. So I think helping the executives have that personal connection to override having to quantify it as a return on investment, to make them empathise and create that real empathy is one of the most successful points. So that's why I always focus on diversity of thought and experience, because health and well-being affects you irrespective of your gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, etc. And I think reframing the conversation in that way is proving more effective with our engagement with site workers, with executives, and all levels in between.
Brilliant. And sorry, remind me how long ago it was that you founded
So I earned my stripes in diversity, my rainbow stripes, 4 years ago when I set up Inter-Engineering, partly because to connect LGBT engineers with one another. My company, who I was employed with at the time, had a culture from the 1970s, so I voted with my feet and left. Classic example of loss of talent and attrition. Set up Eco-Engineers last year, and to date we've ran 10 careers fairs up and down the country. And what's been really eye-opening for me is the hidden elements of diversity, the sexual orientation and disability, and other things that you can't see on the surface necessarily about people. I wanted to run a role model program for disabled engineers. I got 10 or 12 volunteers through LinkedIn that nominated themselves. 50% of those people wanted to do it anonymously, or it would have to be through animation, through voiceovers, etc., because they didn't want it to be attributed. So I think there's a real stigma still around lots of stuff, and it's demystifying that. That's the key. In engineering, we love measuring things, we love monitoring things. Diversity seems to be the only thing that isn't treated in such a way like we would safety or quality management. And what other business process would you not baseline to know exactly where you are now, then bring in interventions, and then reevaluate further down the line? Right now, there are too many engineering and tech organizations that are being reactive, and they're simply looking at gender and ethnicity, anticipating ethnicity, pay gap reporting, etc. People are nervous, and there's a misunderstanding around what you can collect. You can collect personal data, but so long as you're transparent and it's held securely in a way. But it's about, like the conversation we had this morning, it's around trust and building that trust in your workforce and your clients. And if you don't have it, then it'll be difficult to collect it.
Great, thank you. And Georgia, this ties in really well with the work that you do, both as a civil engineer and as a careers coach for young people in STEM. You've talked before on the issue of going beyond recruitment to retention, so the importance of actually creating an environment that people feel happy in, diverse people feel happy in. How do you think employers can improve working environments for diverse groups?
I think the focus needs to be more on inclusion. I think diversity and through recruitment is quite a quick fix. In terms of inclusion, is really about changing the company's culture, and that can't easily be measured, or it's not even like it could be a quick returns. It takes a lot of time and effort, and you don't always know if those things are going to work. The policies and procedures you put in place, you don't know at what point it will shift the company's culture. So I feel like it really needs to be on inclusion and also commitment, because diversity and also innovation is very like buzzwords, but you actually have to be committed in putting effective policies into improving working environments for people from diverse backgrounds. And I think that if you have an inclusive culture and environment, it will naturally attract diversity, because the people that will come in will feel comfortable, and your best kind of advertisement for a good workplace environment is your own people. So I feel like the focus needs to be more on inclusion, and also like having effective groups, because a lot of companies, they have these kind of outward groups like sort of BAME or Women in Engineering, which is all great, but if the board level are not committed to them, they're just ineffective. They don't have any power or influence over changing that culture. They're just kind of siloed with no real power to change in the working environments.
And you told me the other day that you came to engineering, well, you found out about engineering quite late. How old were you again?
I was 16.
Okay, well, I suppose it's not that late. But do you feel like with the work that you do with careers coaching in STEM, do you feel as though the opportunity to get into engineering is sort of felt enough by diverse young people?
No. I think a lot of people, adults included, don't know what engineering is. Okay. Even the kind of civil engineering definition I was given, I don't do any of that. I don't do bridges, I don't do buildings, I do utilities. So it has really nothing to do with the kind of standardized, typical idea of what engineering is. And I think engineering as a whole, the bottom definition is problem solvers. I think if you do a degree in engineering, you're better at finance than people who do finance or business degrees. So it's more about the skills you have. And I think it's just about understanding and giving kind of a common, or becoming engineers a common knowledge, more to focus on what we do in our day-to-day rather than just throwing it at them saying, you must be an engineer, engineering's great. It is, but not everyone's meant to be an engineer. It's just having that common knowledge about what it is.
Great, thank you. And Christine, as an HR consultant specializing in diversity and inclusion, does this resonate with your experience? What have you seen to be the most sort of useful or successful diversity initiatives in companies?
Yes, I mean, all of this resonates with me. And I mean, in terms of what makes an initiative successful, I like to see it in two strands, if you like. So I think they're what I'll call the building blocks. And that's around having real leadership in the organisation around the D&I agenda, a real belief that it's actually important and therefore part of day-to-day business. Is not something over there. It's, you know, sort of mainstreamed, if you like, and I think, you know, colleagues here mentioned that earlier. And also, you know, that's where the data comes in. I mean, you need to appreciate what your organisation actually looks like. So you have those building blocks that then support the effectiveness of how you actually implement your actions. So in terms of actions, I think there are a number of types of actions that tend to be successful. And if we think recently, we've already talked about gender pay gaps. I mean, certainly, I think that has really made organisations take note. And, you know, so it's that burning platform, if you like. So you need that burning platform to really propel action. But of course, you know, you might know what your gender pay gap is. The trick then is to actually close it. So it's about translating what, if you like, data's telling you into achievable actions and actually monitoring that they're actually delivered. And I think, you know, that's where, again, if you go back to what I said first in terms of the building blocks, you know, the leadership's important, and governance, the whole governance around this agenda is, you know, crucial. Otherwise, it won't happen. I mean, the old adage, what gets measured gets done, is equally relevant to this area.
Do you want to talk a bit about the work you've done at the GLA? Because from what I remember, it was quite pioneering in the sense that it published it published gender pay gap data but without having to. So
yes. So
what was the incentive there?
So last year, the Greater London Authority, as part of the Mayor's ambition to lead by example, actually published their gender pay gap before it was legally required. This year, we've published our ethnicity pay gap before it's legally required. And, you know, we want it to be a legal requirement. And that has really, within the organisation, helped to focus activity. So one of the things in terms of the building blocks I was talking about that's happened, not only as a result of that, but as a result of the ambition, if you like, to really make the organisation as diverse as possible in terms of representation, but also as inclusive as possible in terms of culture. We set up a diversity inclusion management board earlier this year. It had a predecessor. Difference is this one's actually chaired by the chief officer. It has representation from, it's represented by the mayor's office. In fact, the mayor's chief of staff is a member of this board. And the chairs of our staff networks are on this board. So all have, if you like, parity of influence and have a real job in holding people like me to account for delivering on the actions. So that I think is a key thing. We also have indicators in our dashboard around this whole thing, so it's absolutely right there as part of core business, if you like, and everybody's watching, as they would with the money. You know, it always amazes me that organisations, I mean, I think, you know, somebody said it, you said it earlier, tend to forget not just, you know, diversity and inclusion, but actually people. They always remember the money, but yeah, people's right at centre of all of this.
Brilliant. So, question to all of you, really. Once an organisation or a group have decided to engage in a diversity initiative of some sort, what sort of ethical issues do you think they need to keep in mind? Yeah, go first. Yeah.
So I can speak from the website because, so Ethnicity, Facts and Figures is the name of the website. Please do visit. Because it had never been built before, there's no blueprint, there's no model that we could follow. So we had to actually decide for ourselves what are the principles we're going to build for this thing. Partly also because we anticipated it was going to get a lot of noise. People were either skeptical or positive about it. It was going to get a lot of heat. And we decided that there were two principles that we would have to apply. The first was it had to meet data and digital standards. So we spoke to GDS, we spoke to ODI here, we spoke to UK Stats Authority, we spoke to ONS, because a website about data is only going to be useful if people trust it. And that has got to be based on what standards it follows. And the second principle was we would talk to everybody. If it's not been built before, you've no idea what the demand is. There's also, you don't know what the user needs are. So you have to test for those. So academics, NGOs, policy officials, local government, central government, members of the public, expert groups, we tested with all of them. And we said, tell us what it is you want to see on this website, tell us what it needs to look like. As we started to frame it together, as the charts and graphs came together, all of that was tested. And as a policy official, it's actually quite humbling when you put together, you know, a heat map or a geographic map and a person says to you, I have no idea what that data means. Please make it more accessible. And that is actually going to be important. The ethics of open data matter if no one can understand what the hell it looks like. So you do have to listen to your users. But then there are other things in terms of what are you then going to do about it. So that, again, requires principles to it. So I take your point of, you know, what you've done at the GLA. The data has to inform your policies. And some of those policies are going to be hard things like targets. We shouldn't be afraid of targets. They're not quotas. There are different things about that. So I remember on women, we had a target a few years ago for more women on boards. And lots of people said that is unethical. You shouldn't do that because that's tokenistic. Turns out it's actually a very good move because lots of women now on boards, not to the level that we expect, but it's increasing. But also things like, you know, nudge. We should have more incremental changes, practical things that we can all do. The one I'm a big fan of is posters on meeting rooms. How diverse is this meeting room? Ask yourselves this question. Because, you know, at board level, we can have lots of conversations with a few people in the room. On meeting room doors, we can all have this conversation. So I think the ethics of who is involved in this conversation is actually fundamental. And we all have a role in improving diversity. So I think if we make it front and center, that actually gets done.
Great. Just on ethics, Amy, how do you decide what to measure within Project Diamond? How much have you included people, or how inclusive was the process for that?
Well, I wasn't there at the very initial design stage, but we collect against 6 protected characteristics. And at the time, I think they were the protected characteristics where the broadcasters and the TV industry were being most challenged on. So we connect with gender identity, which is transgender, not transgender, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, and disability. Have I missed one or repeated one? And yeah, it's an interesting point because there are more protected characteristics that we could collect data on. And at the moment in the industry, there's a lot of talk about social mobility as well, and whether or not we should be collecting that. But there's obviously lots of kind of discussions at the moment about how best to collect that kind of data. But just going back, if I may, to the ethics point about data collection, one of the things that was really important for the broadcaster setting up Diamond was to ensure that they were collecting the data in the kind of most ethical way possible, and in a way that we would get the most accurate data. And obviously a lot of diversity data is collected in conjunction with applying for a job or with a contract, and so Diamond in some ways is quite light touch in that if you're on a show, you get sent an email saying, here's a diversity form, please will you fill it in? But it's all kind of very anonymous, it's not linked to, you know, employment, so we thought that was the best way that we would get the best data, because we recognise that, you know, perhaps, I know I've done it, I don't know if you have, you get a diversity form, and depending on how you're feeling and who's asking, you might give a slightly different answer, or you might decide to disclose something or not disclose something. So it was really important as well that people knew what we were going to do with their data, how it was going to be stored, how it would be used, how it wouldn't be used. And again, I think that's really important in gaining people's trust, isn't it? Aside from the kind of ethical issues, but that kind of trust of how you, that trust that you can build up with people.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have anything they want to add on ethics?
I was just thinking, be prepared to learn about what you are not, and be prepared to make mistakes. The whole thing that holds back people generally about engaging in the diversity conversation is that they think it's political correctness, feels like they've got to walk on eggshells, so therefore the conversation's never had because they feel for fear of offence or potential offence, but then it happens at the pub where they decompress, and you know that's just not good. You want a culture is the key word, as you said, that wraps it all together. So, and be open to, if you're leading an organisation or an initiative, be open to making those mistakes yourself. Now, I've done that as a white, cisgendered, able-bodied male, gay male. I feel very comfortable in my LGB sphere, LG really, sphere, talking about lesbian gay issues. But running into engineering, I had to proactively seek out transgender engineers to learn about their experiences, because I've not walked in their shoes. So now I'm at a point where I feel like I can advocate for them. Setting up Equal Engineers, it's broadened it out even further to learning about disability, learning about ethnicity, and all those other traits. Now, I've made mistakes at my careers fairs in the past, discovered what a Rexon key is for getting access to a disabled toilet recently, elements of accessibility on my website, etc. It's an iterative process. And the thing is, as we move towards a more inclusive culture, you're always going to have to change your processes, your procedures, make things more accessible. I hired a venue that I thought was accessible. Turns out someone who turned up couldn't use the lift because their wheelchair was too big. They had to come up in the goods lift. Now, I don't want that. It's completely ironic for me to run in an inclusion event where someone feels they have to be treated different at the point of entrance. So I will not be using that venue again, and I will be now pushing for building standards to have accessibility statements for when I'm hiring a venue. I can make a decision at the beginning whether or not they're even going to get my business. So leaders of big corporations and even small business units and even SMEs need to be having those thoughts all the time.
I think just in terms of ethics and who to include and things like that, I think it's very dangerous also to only pick a small collection of people to add towards these decision factors, because one experience or one person from a diverse group doesn't reflect everybody. Like me, myself, as a young black female in engineering, I wouldn't necessarily say I'm the expert. There needs to be a collection of people within the same parameters contributing to the conversation, because it's very dangerous to only speak to one person and think, okay, I've spoken to this person, that's a tick off the list, because everyone's experiences are different. And even within big companies and industries, there's always silos, different industries and departments, even within one company, have different cultures and people are treated differently. Like for me, working on site or working in the office, completely different. I, even myself, would act completely different when I'm on site compared to when I'm in the office.
We've got a question from Slide. We've got a few questions from Slide here, thank you, that relates to both of you, actually. So what needs to change the image of engineering to attract greater diversity? Are schools part of the problem? Georgia, what do you think?
I think, yes. In terms of, as a teacher, you obviously wanted to be a teacher, so you wouldn't necessarily go and find out about what engineering is because you wanted to be a teacher. The same with me, I'm an engineer, I don't necessarily know what an investment banker does, or even a doctor on a day-to-day, or different types. So I think there is kind of lack of understanding, and I think schools have a responsibility to a certain extent. I think it's also to do with parents as well, and their understanding of the opportunities for their children. I think as an industry, we are trying to change, and that's on a big scale. We are trying to do, like, this year is the year of the engineer, and also the Institute of Civil Engineers turned 200 this year, so there's been a lot of focus and initiatives to encourage just a normal person to understand what it is, not just civil engineering, but engineering as a whole. And there's been loads of initiatives, but if you don't know, you won't know. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Parents, teachers, careers advisors all need to be educated on what an engineer is, how you can become an engineer, and the different entry routes. And an example of misconceptions, I invited along lots of special educational needs disability schools to my careers fairs. This is anecdotal, it's not causation necessarily, but a lot of people said, no, sorry, it wouldn't be appropriate for our students. One school in Bristol did come along, and one of the students from that school solved the Ministry of Defence's puzzle within 10 seconds when the average is 10 minutes. So the point is, there'll be a whole load of schools that could have come along, but because the teachers, careers advisors, etc., chose to not bring them and expose them to that opportunity, those individuals missed out on that. I appreciate there's a spectrum and some people are just learning basic life skills to function in society, but there is a whole tranche out there of talent under that characteristic of disability that could benefit. So it's about educating the people that have they're accustomed to this bubble and they don't think beyond, and it's doing it in a polite way that brings them into the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the ways to rectify that is that I'm partnering up with the Engineering Development Trust to target 50 SEN schools next year using the EDT's resources that they have through Equal Engineers.
Great, thank you. So another question from Slido. Mark earlier mentioned that when workplaces aren't inclusive, people leave. Well, we've discussed that a bit today. How should the open data sector create more inclusion and retention within its own workforce? Christine, have you got ideas around that, given your experience?
Yeah, could you repeat the question again,
Sorry,
please?
yes.
Yeah.
When workplaces aren't inclusive, people leave. How should the open data sector, so I suppose sort of STEM and engineering and all of these kind of related sectors, create more inclusion and retention within their own workforce?
Yeah. I mean, just thinking of what I've heard so far as well, it makes me think, and this is relevant to this question, I think, makes me think about the fact that there's an awful lot of unconscious bias happening in organisations and even, in schools. Yeah, people make assumptions. They don't always know they make assumptions. They behave according to those assumptions. So I think part of what will help is actually, working with the leadership, with the recruiting managers, with managers, to really help them to understand what an inclusive culture is, how to behave in an inclusive way, which will impact on how people feel about working in the organisation and will determine whether they stay or leave or give their discretionary effort, etc. So a lot of it is education, but educating people on what they might not be aware of in themselves, if I can put it that way.
Yeah. Does anyone else have a point?
If I can just add, so I mean, the civil service is increasingly diverse at the junior levels, but I am one of 5% of people at my level and above. And so it is not very diverse by ethnicity at the senior levels, and it has to do something about that. And so this year we adopted targets to increase the number, and it's a progressive target and it spans 10 years. So we recognize they're not going to be done overnight, so we've got a plan that says this is your progressive chart in that. And we've put the money and the support behind doing it. So we've not just set a target, we've said it's going to take, as you say, a lot of leadership. It's going to take an actual support team. But it's not just about expecting people to come to you and say, yes, I want to be a civil servant. You're going to have to find these people. You're going to have a demand and supply flow. So there's an outreach capability in that. There's recognizing that you have to support people in your system in the pipeline, but also bring people from outside to do that. And then just having this conversation. So I take a lot of what Mark said. People are not comfortable talking about ethnicity. They're just not. By virtue of doing this project, we recognize that. So we have to get over this. However we do that, down to the culture, down to leadership. But we do need to find what our issues are. So a lot of the lexicon around this is quite dated, so we have to be more comfortable about who we engage and how we do it. And a good example for us was, so you mentioned BAME. So we went around, saying, what does BAME mean to you? Out of hundreds of people, only one person knew what it meant. So again, we have to be clear what it is we're talking about. So there's no point in having a BAME policy if nobody knows what BAME means. So it does matter how we talk about this, and asking ethnic minority people to also talk about their experiences of bias is helpful to help people understand how unintentionally bias does flow into our systems and our workplaces, and how we're going to overcome that, because we can learn from each other. And I think that is a painful thing, but hopefully something good can come out of that if we do it collectively. And I also think the reality of recognizing this challenge has been here for a long time. This didn't just happen overnight. We've had disparities on gender, on ethnicity, on LGBT, on disability, on religion for decades. The data has told us that. But what is different now is that we're having the conversation far more openly. We are here and talking about this. So my goal is to hope that open data will lead to open dialogue, open societies, and we're not yet there. So that the truth is to admit that, first of all. But I think if the goal is open dialogue, I think there's something worth achieving.
But it has to be had in a way that doesn't shut down the white, cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied men in the profession.
Absolutely.
I gave a presentation last week, unconscious bias training, to 4 engineers at site. They were sat with their arms crossed. Tell me an interesting fact about yourself. I don't want to be here. I was like, oh God, hard audience. By the end of it, one of them, what I found interesting was they almost self-regulated between one another. And one of them said, look, sometimes you're just too much. I have to tell you to, calm it down. And then he looked at me and he said, I've got a wife who's Danish. I'm coming home at night. She's in tears with Brexit, etc. And I'm coming at the workplace and there's this conversation going on. So, going from arms crossed to my session frames that are around privilege, and they kind of can't, they have to, that video that's got this football coach that asks all these questions and you end up seeing the line of privilege from where you are in life, because all the questions are based on just your circumstance rather than anything you've achieved. That's such a powerful video. If you've not watched it, go and look it up on YouTube. Race privilege, $100 race privilege it's called. They just can't argue with it. And then they have to accept that they do have privilege, and it's about creating a way that they can then use that position of privilege to the advantage of others. But you have to create active listeners first rather than shutting them down and it becoming this blame game culture that we kind of have around the whole EDI conversation.
So going back to data itself, sort of diversity data itself, how do you go about communicating? What's the narrative around data? Once you've collected diversity data, say you're a company or government, how do you express it?
I think that's a very good question. Because, a lot of the issue around this data is it's underreported, it's inconsistent, people aren't giving their data in the first place. So you have to build the trust so people give you more data in diverse spheres. For us, the challenge was we had skeptics inside and outside. Internally, government departments said to us, we already published this data, so what's the issue about putting it on a website when you can find the report? And we said, well, it's to make it open, it's to make it accessible, so that's why we need to do it. Externally, different diversity groups were telling us, we don't need a website. We already know what the problem is. Give me a race strategy. And so the issue has to be, you need to take people with you about why you're doing it. Because you're right, people will not trust you if they don't know what you're going to do with this data. Now we've built it, people love the thing, and I'm really proud of that. But it's about saying, because you've never seen it before, because it's not been envisaged before, you do have to take the audience with you, and that requires trust. But what I do hope it will mean is that that will lead to better data collection across this, because people now see what it's actually leading to, because they can access it for the first time in a way that wasn't possible before. So if they see themselves as users and beneficiaries of that data, maybe that will lead to better collections of data, resolving inconsistencies. But we don't talk about the data in that way yet. I think that's part of the challenge.
I think it's really hard as well, I think, to communicate diversity data, because I think in the past, especially in the industry I work in now, there's been a lot of kind of hard facts. So this many people are female, this many people are male. And of course, kind of conversations about whether people identify as female or male or something completely different have changed, especially over the last kind of 5 years. So I think kind of trying to collect something which people think are kind of fixed, where actually a lot of the protected characteristics are kind of mutable. So I think it makes it very hard when people get data and then the next set of data looks slightly different. They just assume it's wrong rather than kind of question why might it be different and what else is happening. And I think there's just generally, most people don't really know what to do when they get given some data. They kind of look at it and assume it must be right. They don't necessarily ask questions about where it's come from, how is it collected, well, what was the question that was actually asked. So I think that's one of the things that's quite difficult when you're communicating, especially when people want kind of snapshots, they want the headlines. And I think that's is something it's quite challenging, and how do we kind of raise that kind of data literacy of people? And again, I think schools obviously have a role in that, and I think some of them are with the kind of fake news conversation. How do you identify that this news is fake or not fake? And the same with data. How do you identify good data or bad data? And what are the questions that you should be asking?
We've got so many great questions, and we've only got 2.5 minutes left. So I'll go for the most popular. Companies' house data shows that the number of women being appointed to directorships has flatlined about 20% since 2000. Why is this despite all the initiatives?
I think just going back to what I was saying before about the commitment, because I think there's like understanding or an assumption that things will just change. It's natural, things will change, but they have to be targeted. Unless you're saying, okay, we want this many, an actual number, you can't just say we want to improve or we are improving. It needs to be actual figures so that you can work towards it. It's just like, you can't hit a target you can't see. So it's great, there's loads of initiatives. So even like, for example, women in engineering, things like that. Yeah, we want more women, so we're going to say, okay, but it needs to become attractive. It needs to change the understanding that a board isn't just this. It needs to have a vision and what they want it to be, not just saying it to meet a quota. They need to actually understand the effectiveness of having a diverse board, and not just saying, oh, we're just doing it because it's just, I think it's to do with understanding and changing what it means to be at board level.
Just briefly on this, because I know these numbers. What has happened is partly lots of women have taken up the NED roles, the non-exec director roles. So the gap is still real in that women don't hold many executive positions, what are paid at board level. But also in the last couple of years, so multiple women have multiple board roles. I sit on 4 boards, and that is actually quite common. So the minute 3 or 4 of those women stand down, you get a drop in the numbers. So we have to recognize it's going to do that for a while. So we do need to, as you say, feed the pipeline to stop that actually having a negative effect in the numbers. But we also need to encourage more boards to actually give women paid board roles, not just expect them to be volunteers all the time. Because that could also be an inhibitor.
Yeah, brilliant. And Christine, based on your experience, do you have any further comments on that?
No, I think I agree with, what people say. It's really explaining, the benefits and encouraging and selling.
Yeah.
You're not talking about selling in all of this, but this is a selling job as much as anything.
Brilliant. And we've just run out of time, so thank you so much to a brilliant panel.